The just concluded three-day U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit opened with a spotlight on Africa's youthful population, with the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, making the case that the continent's demographics will inevitably lead it to become a key global player in the decades to come. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Fafanua Afrika, a show that addresses topical issues as they relate to the African youth, their involvement and their participation. I'm Blessings Mosugu. Do stay with us. Now, the Joe Biden administration has announced several new investments to support Africa in terms of innovation and entrepreneurship, the trade, technology, and so on, a bulk of which will directly involve youths on the continent. One of these initiatives, according to the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, is the investment of an additional $100 million to expand the Young African Leaders Initiative. In addition, the U.S. Export-Import Bank will be entering new memorandums of understanding that will clear the way for $1 billion in new commercial financing in Africa. Now, Harris said Africa's youth represent an enormous potential for the world in terms of economic growth and for social and political progress. So, if the world sees potentials, how can youth themselves maximize the gifts that they have and tap into these opportunities? Well, joining me now all the way from Gauteng, South Africa, is Senior Researcher and Program Coordinator at Southern Africa Liason Office, Lwazi Somya. And of course, from Abuja, Nigeria's capital, let's meet the second guest, writer and Pan-Africanist, Tamunokuro, Obietonbara. I hope that I got that correctly. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
It's my pleasure. So please just say something. Let me be sure that I have both of you joining me.
Yes, thank you for inviting me.
All right, thank you so much for joining me, Tamuno and Lwazi. So let's go straight into it. Now, we see that at the Leaders Summit, the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit, the issue of the African youth was brought up again, and they're talking about their ability to lead. That's the leadership ability of the youths in Africa. Why do you think all of a sudden the spotlight is on the African youth? I'll start with Tamuno. Please share your thoughts.
For having me. Always a pleasure being on this channel. I'm not surprised that their interest is on the African youth, because from the statistics we see that by 2035, half of young people in the world will be in Africa. And we now live in a world that is driven by artificial intelligence, algorithms, a world that has been led by tech. And young African people are seriously into tech, because that is the future, right? And so what I think the US is interested in is how to maintain their influence on the continent, because the truth is Africa is the continent of the future. Africa is going to be the continent that is going to be reckoned with in the next 50 years. So they are doing everything possible to ensure that they have their influence on the continent. Now, the question is, is the US a friend of Africa? Are we ready to answer that question? Does the US really care about Africa? And if you want my honest opinion, I would say no. I don't think that the United States government is a friend of Africa. And I'm saying this based on historical antecedents and what the United States has done from country to country across Africa. Right now, there are over 29 military bases, US military bases on the continent. And you ask them, what are they doing with their military bases scattered across the continent? They even have what they call AFRICOM, that is the US African Command, a military wing designed to keep check on the continent. So these are very serious issues. But I think that the reason why the focus right now is on the youth is because they realize that the future is Africa, and the future is going to be driven by tech, and young African people are becoming more innovative, and more young African people need to be influenced so that future policies will be geared towards the US. Future policies will be geared in such a way that young African people see the US as ally instead of looking at, let's say, China or Russia. So it's all politics for me.
All right, thank you so much, Tamunokuro. I'll come back to you to take it up with the issue of U.S. not being so interested in Africa. But let me hear Lwazi's thoughts on this. Do you think that the U.S. is actually interested, and why do you think there is a sudden interest in the youth in Africa?
So this is a multi-year initiative that the USA government has embarked upon, and it stems from Donald Trump's administration of lack of engagement with the African continent and China's rise within trade and industry, in particular Chinese financing of African businesses. And part and parcel of this is that the USA sees itself as a competitor of China, and therefore the new influx of US capital within the African continent is derived at influencing its political and civil society base. And part and parcel of this is that the USA has seen that it's losing soft power within the global international sphere, and in the inability for themselves to leverage upon their old historically renowned soft power. As we have seen with the Russia-Ukraine war, a lot of African states either chose to be neutral or vote against US-based sanctions on the Russian government. And you've seen this with other aspects, including the US's diplomatic relations with the Eastern Pacific, where tensions are currently rising with China, in particular, the Indo-Ocean Pacific Rim area, which the USA itself is planning to have greater influence within it. So this re-engagement with Africa and the rest of the world, it all stems from the Donald Trump's era, where Donald Trump chose to disinvest from the entire international community. Now, President Joe Biden, as a Democrat, believes that America's strongest positioning is with re-engagement and not harping onto nationalistic right-wing politics that the previous administration held. So you see more recently a revigoration of the Clinton-era Africa Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA, which allows African goods to gain access into the United States. The Prosper Africa initiative, which is a two-way trade initiative between the USA and Africa, which was started in 2018 during the beginning stages of the the Biden administration, and the Power Africa initiatives, which was created by the Obama administration during the mid 2000s. So all these initiatives now are being revitalized by the current Biden administration in order for them to counteract China and Russia's influence within the African continent.
Okay, so the US being interested in Africa's growth and economic development is one thing, but then why the sudden interest in the youth in Africa? I would like to ask Tamunokuro this question. Now, if you say that the US is not exactly interested in Africa, what is in it for them to gain, especially looking at the growth of the youth in Africa? Is there something in it for them, or why the sudden spotlight?
Okay, so now there is a new player. There's a new player, which is China. And, I followed the summit. And by the way, I think it's kind of shameful, if I'm going to speak my mind, I think it's shameful that the president of the United States will call on African leaders to go meet him in Washington, in what they call US Africa Summit. We've seen our leaders disrespect themselves all the time. There is what they call India African Summit, China African Summit, Russia African Summit. It's because our leaders don't have our continental leaders don't have respect for themselves. I'm digressing, I know, but when are we going to see an Africa U.S. summit? Do we invite the leaders of the United States, to African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to answer certain questions, and see if we can influence the policies. But now back to your original question. The point is they are being extremely worried with the influence of China and the influence of Russia on the continent. More and more African leaders are looking towards China. They're taking loans from China to develop their countries. And so I think that what the US is doing is to see how they can influence the future leaders of this continent, because they know that, if they focus on the youths now, the youths today will be the leaders tomorrow. So what they are doing is to exert their influence on the future leaders of this continent so that they will continue to have the kind of influence that they have on the continent right now, which is very detrimental to the development of the continent, because all we see is how the United States government over the years has been exploiting African countries. Now, if you read White Malice, it's a book written by Susan Williams. White Malice talks about the CIA and the covert recolonization of the continent. It's a book I'm going to ask every young African to read. There's also another book called Dirty Works. Dirty Works was written in 1980. It talks about how the CIA has been very instrumental in the underdevelopment of many African countries, the assassination of many African leaders that really mean well for our countries across the continent. So the tide is changing. There's a new player in town, which is China, and China influence is growing on the continent every single day. And what they're trying to do now is to focus on the young people, to take their attention away from China so that they can focus on the United States. That way the US will continue or whatever influence they have on the continent. If they're not doing it because they really care about us, no, they are doing it because they want to maintain whatever influence they have on the continent, which, in my opinion, has been very detrimental for us as a people. So I don't know if truly they've looked at themselves from a biological point of view and now say, okay, maybe it's time we become honest with African people. But if that is the case, well, good and fine. But I know that looking at historical antecedents, they've never cared. They've done everything possible to undermine our countries. That is an historical fact and an ever-present truth.
Okay, now let me come back to Lwazi. I mean, Tamuno has mentioned that it's not exactly in the interest of the United States talking about the growth of the African youth, but it seems as if the African youth are like a pawn in the whole game between the US and China, talking about, Lwazi mentioned losing self-power, the US losing self-power. So this brings me to asking this question. It looks as if every other country except Africa recognizes the power that African youths have. And so they're trying to harness that power and influence their decision on, like Tamuno mentioned, the next generation, the next leading generation. So is it that the African leaders do not see the potentials in African youths? And then, let's even forget that this whole thing is a whole pawn in the big game, but it looks like the external bodies are seeing the influence that the youths have, especially the youths in Africa, but the African leaders do not see the influence that the African youths themselves have. Lwazi, what do you have to say about that?
I think African leaders do see the influence the youth do have and the potential that the youth does have within their continents. And this is why African leaders create so many hurdles that young people have to jump through in order for them to attain power. And this is why African leaders themselves fail to acknowledge the role that the youth can have in the development of the states because they want to sustain and keep their power. Moving on to the United States, there's also very critical aspects about the financing from the US agreements, because we can see that they've channeled around $350 million in terms of the digital economy within the African continent. And that obviously has to play a role with the youth's investment into the digital age and digital economy, along with investing around $500 million to reduce transportation costs in key West African ports around Benin and other countries. So you see there's a steady push by the USA to create greater ease of trade and access to the African economy in order for them to have better influence on the young people. But you also see the same pushing happening from China and Russia in terms of their infrastructure and African development. Now, the role of African states is to meet their own national interests, and part and parcel of the national interests of African states is to leverage upon the best deal that the African people can get within the international system and to create a best case scenario for one's people. What is currently happening with these different governments is that we're negotiating bad deals on the behalf of the African people, which will result in perpetual generational poverty in terms of the future developmental trajectory of African states. Once our African leaders realize the power of negotiation in terms of international platforms and these deal agreements and loans that we are taking out in the post-COVID-19 pandemic economy, we will once again realize how the entire international system is not set up for generosity and charity anymore. It is a situation where African leaders will be firm in terms of historic debt retrieval and forgiveness, and moving on to developmental financing that is best beneficial towards African states and infrastructure in terms of education, healthcare, and other relevant aspects to uplift young people. But also the realization by the USA now, since their engagement, is that there's a political black spot within influencing the African continent, and therefore realization that re-engagement with the African continent will undermine Russia and Chinese efforts towards greater cooperation between the two continental power heads. So this entire international system itself has moved away from the unipolar US dominance that we've seen in the 1990s, but is now moving towards a more multipolar nature where various regional actors have greater influence upon the future and trajectory of various continental regions.
Thank you so much, Tamuno, and thank you, Lwazi, for explaining that. We're going to come back to this topic because I have a lot of questions from what you both have said. But right now, I'd like for us to hear the voices of the youths concerning this matter. I mean, the youths, they say, are the leaders of tomorrow. So let's hear what they have to say in this Vox Pop, and we'll be right back to talk about it in the back end.
Young people are frequently pushed to the side when discussions regarding leadership, policy making, conflict resolutions are discussed about. A large percentage of people see them as potentially dangerous subjects, and policy approaches often regard them as the problem. Youths are subjected to stereotypical images of being angry, violent, drugged, and seen as a threat. And if you look at most developing countries like Nigeria, the youth population is about 64% of the unemployed Nigerian. So what that means is that the most agile group of the country remain unemployed. You see vices that support terrorism, carrying of arms, all this can be linked to unemployment. So, but however, the youth shouldn't be excluded. Leadership trainings can be done, capacity building, job creation, ensuring that youths get into politics at different cadres, ranging from the grassroots to top-tier positions. Youth should be conceptualized, studied, and empowered in agents or as agents of positive change.
Since Abiy Ahmed has taken power, unemployment has been in a steady decline, specifically for the youth in Ethiopia. In addition to that, schools and colleges have been converted into training grounds for military and torture camps for the innocent civilians. Not only unemployment has been in a steady decline, but the output of schools and colleges has been in a steady decline in addition to that. Primarily, if you focus on Tigray, for the past 2 years, the youth has been targeted, killed, massacred, raped, and tortured. Not only by Ethiopian troops, but by foreign troops, like the likes of Eritrean troops as well. The youth in Ethiopia, in addition to Tigray, throughout the country, has been subject to forced military recruitment in a state of finding jobs and contributing to the economy.
African youth are special breed. They're dynamic, they're energetic, they're strong, and they pursue excellence in every of their doings. We are result-oriented. African youth are result-oriented, and we are doing well. The only thing I want African youth to take interest in is governance. Let African youth be involved in democratic process, electioneering, not only just to support, but as well to vie for opposition, and let African youth support Africa youth for better Africa. I believe in African youth.
Well, those were the opinions of the youth across Africa, and we are still talking about the Leadership Summit that is currently ongoing, the US-Africa Leadership Summit, where once again the African youth have been spotlighted. And I still have with me Tamunokuro, a writer and a Pan-Africanist, and also a liaison officer and a researcher, Lwazi. Thank you so much for staying with me, gentlemen. All right, so before we checked out the Vox Pop, we're talking about the US and Africa being a pawn in the whole game. Now, my question is, and I'll start with you, Lwazi, how do we avoid this? How do we avoid the reoccurrence of this situation? Because several times we've seen where in the whole power play, Africa is just, at the mercy of these Western countries. And it looks like it's because we don't have enough facilities, enough equipment to stand on our own, better ourselves, especially as youth. So what do we do? What is the way forward? I mean, earlier we've talked about how the US may or may not care about Africa and how it's all a game. But now I want us to focus on Africa and the youth especially. What do we do to stand on our own? I would use the climate change, for example. I mean, Africa contributes the least and we suffer the most. And for several years, we've been getting promises and promises from these Western countries. And at the dying minute, they, turned back on their words and said that the money is not even enough for them before, considering us. So it looks like it is the same path we're touring, is the same path we're moving towards. So how do we avoid the recurrence of this situation, Lwazi?
So first and foremost, a lot of the problems highlighted by the viewers and the listeners to the show were that of African governance and African leadership, and whether or not we are up to scratch in terms of international based norms when it comes to negotiations, leadership, capacity, fighting corruption, and ensure we have the institutional basis that we as Africans hold ourselves accountable to. So part and parcel of this is ensuring that we elect the correct leaders from the get-go. The leaders who are able to take the voices of the youth and implement and negotiate on behalf of the country to the best of their ability, and also getting the country the best deals that can take. Part and parcel of why South Africa itself has been undermined within international fora is that we go there disunited in terms of our policy approaches towards these international agreements. For example, voting in UN leadership, from even our disagreements about even our continental bodies, financing of our own institutions, African states themselves, we have a chronic leadership crisis that's perpetuated throughout all countries. And this is why youth has become very much more agitated and very much more disillusioned with the entire notion of African leadership, as they have seen their leaders fail and them not getting access to upper structures to make fundamental changes to African states. And what we need to do as young people is to create transnational solidarity networks where we support one another throughout the entire continent and rebuild this prosperity of Pan-Africanism that my previous speaker alluded to previously in his previous comments, but also realize that we need to also get the best deals possible on the international community, and that one enemy is my enemy is not necessarily my friend, but understanding that each country is best serving towards their own national interests, without us thinking that we are a charity case towards the world, because we are not a charity case as the African continent. We have the best negotiation leveraging in terms of our resources and our human resource capacity. However, we have failed to utilize this to the best of our ability, and have chosen to leverage upon these. The USA was very smart in going towards this Africa-US summit. They wanted to create a joiner to the African continental free trade agreement, which we as Africans pride ourselves in, because it will unlock our potential economic capacity. Now, with the USA involvement in terms of bilateral agreements concerning the African continental free trade agreement, it takes it out of our own hands to leading this continent's developmental trajectory. And we must be very conscious going forward in terms of our engagement with the international community.
All right, thank you so much, Lwazi. I like what you said there, that Africa and Africa youths are not a charity case. And I'll still like to throw the same question at Tamuno. What do you think is the way forward? How do you think the youths can take solutions into their own hands and not look like a charity case to the Western world?
Thank you. Clearly, we are not a charity case. I usually say that the world is not aiding Africa. It is Africa that is aiding the world. It is important that we as African youths understand, first of all, our history. That's why I tell African youths, invest in books, read, know about your history, so that you can make informed decisions. We need to organize ourselves and see how we can begin to influence policies We need to start influencing policies. We need to start, being part of the governance structure of our countries. It's very important. We shouldn't just get caught up with the mundane, with the social media trends and all that. It's important to have, to be involved with all the social media stuff. But we're talking about real life here. We're talking about our future. We're talking about the survival of our continent. So we must begin to take actions. We need to organize ourselves and get involved in politics, get involved in the elections of our countries. Next year, there will be elections in Nigeria, for instance. I tell young Africans like myself, you can't just sit by the side and just complain, because if we don't put the right people in power, we make up the majority in all countries in Africa. Young people make up the majority. So if we don't put the right people in power, we will continue this cycle of having leaderships that are going to lack the innovations, that will lack, that will lack the skill set in how to take us away from this morass that we are stuck in. So it's important that as young African people, we get, we get ourselves into the governance structure of our countries. We participate in the politics of our countries. In Nigeria, we have the not too young to run bill, even though at the same time they've created systems that make it difficult for young people to run for elections. But we have a voice, we have votes. And so we can begin to, for the first step, put in people in power that we know can protect our interests as young African people, that will make the right investments, in the lives of young African people, so that we can stand shoulder to shoulder with youth across the world. Because young Africans are very intelligent. They're very intelligent. Look, if you look at, young Africans schooling in the US, in Russia, they are breaking records. That's how intelligent we are. Because after all, we have all the blood of Sunni Ali and Mansa Musa and the Moors, and the men and women who gave civilization to the rest of the world. We still have that in us. So we've not lost it. So it's very important that we begin to take charge as young people, so that we can change the paradigm. If we sit just by the side and just complain, nothing is going to change.
All right. Thank you so much, Tamuno, for that. Please still stay with me, Tamuno and Lwazi. We'll go on a short break now. It's time for us to call for a break. And when we come back, we'll continue the conversation with our guests, of course. And we'll also share with you the reactions from social media on this particular topic, talking about the US-Africa Summit, Leadership Summit, and their spotlighting of the African youth. Don't go anywhere. Thank you for staying with us on Fafanua Afrika. Now, we have been talking about the US-Africa Summit with a focus on the Africa youth. Aside from looking to strengthen the US-Africa ties, the Leadership Summit is also shining the light on the youths in Africa. And in the course of talking about the youths, the Young African Leadership Initiative was mentioned. Now, the Young African Leadership Initiative, which is also known as YALI, is an initiative of the United States Department of State, which was introduced in 2010 by President Barack Obama. Now, YALI is a program aimed at educating and networking young African leaders with activities which include the Mandela Washington Fellowship. In 2014, the program was expanded to include 4 regional leadership centers in Ghana, Kenya, Senegal, and South Africa. Now, I still have with me from Gauteng, South Africa, the senior researcher and the program coordinator at Southern Africa Liason Office, Lwazi Somya. And of course, I still have from Abuja, Nigeria's capital, the second guest, writer and Pan-Africanist, Tamunokuro Obietonbara. I was asking earlier if I did justice to the name, and I apologize if I did not. But thank you so much, gentlemen, for still staying with me on the show.
Thank you.
My pleasure. All right, so we were still talking about the U.S. involvement in youth improvement and, development in Africa. And I would like to also ask this question. I'll start with you, Lwazi. Let's say that the U.S. makes good on their $100 million investment to the youth development in Africa. there still seems to be a barrier, which is the African leaders, because it looks like no matter what happens, the African leaders are not so invested in the development and digitization of youth processes and all that. And earlier you mentioned that it's not as though they are not interested. So I would like for you to help us clarify that. Let's say that the US gives that money to the African youths. Do we think that there will be a problem with the African leaders releasing that amount of money to solely the development of the youth?
So we must also realize that the money being spent by the USA is not just for charitable purposes or for goodwill of the USA. It is a means towards soft power, attaining of soft power within the African continent and influencing a future generation of African leadership, including a similar program is had by the British called Chevening, a similar program in the United States, YALI, a similar program conducted by China, through the various Confucius Institutes. So this is all part and parcel of influencing Africa and African people and young people in particular. Well, what we might have a problem with is that we've gotten ourselves in a rug of where we have created oligarchical tendencies towards African development, where African leaders feel free to have it with the public purse. And this also comes with issues around aid and sponsorship towards various initiatives and ring fencing of money towards initiatives. So once we deal with the corruption within our own continent, maybe we can have a frank discussion on whether the intention of African leaders is that to prevent youth development, or is it a far more criminal or selfish act of a simple action of corruption at hand. And this is why in international bodies rather would do the development and dispensation of the money themselves within the African continent. So you see the UN food program towards issues around youth building of schools, that UN aids the implementation of programs by USAID, and all the other manifestations of international development that the international community thinks is benefiting Africa. They are all generated in that manner. So part and parcel from us as Africans is realizing, number one, this is not for the sake of Africans, just for the sake of Africans. It has a far more soft power and inclination of having influence and changing perceptions around one's country in order for you for in the long term, create better relations with that country, to not either to exploit for resources or to build economic ties between the two countries, which is beneficial for your own people. And secondly, is that the influence of Africa as a key demographic that's growing in a world global population that's growing faster than other continents. Africa is indeed the continent of the present, and this is why early investment by the countries like the United States becomes very important. And we have seen over the while initiatives such as FOCAC, which was very focused on China, and more recently the EU came to the African Union headquarters to deliberate on future cooperation between the EU and the EU. So all these initiatives by the international community are just generated to influence Africa, and we will be very cautious of how we as Africans respond and how we negotiate the deals that stem from this diplomatic efforts stemming from the international community.
Okay, thank you so much, Lwazi. Now, let me ask Tamuno this question. Earlier, you were mentioning Sule Ali, Mansa Musa, and the likes, and these are people who, in their youthful age and their youthful time, fought for development and freedom, in the continent. Now, I would also like to ask, comparing that now with the youth participation and involvement in this recent day and time, how would you say the youth are faring when it comes to participation? How would you rate the youth participation, especially when it comes to politics?
Yeah, okay. So first of all, you see, something has brought us to this point. And we see, if we're going to be honest, like earlier, I asked a question. And the question I asked is the US a friend of Africa? And if we're going to be honest with ourselves, I said, with an emphatic no, the US is not a friend of Africa. And that is because of the US historical antecedents on the continent, the assassination of many African leaders that can be traced back to the CIA, the coups that have been carried out across the continent, the subjugation of the continent, of our countries, through Western institutions like the IMF, the exploitation of our countries. And we saw young African leaders like Thomas Sankara, young African leaders like Patrice Lumumba, young African leaders like Samora Michel. They were all killed. And we can trace their assassination to Western subjugation of the continent. So what has happened is that at the moment, we have a leadership, who are not even free. We need to tell ourselves the truth. We as a continent, we are not free. We have a leadership that is not free, a leadership that is being controlled by foreign powers. And this leadership, it doesn't matter how long they remain in power, it doesn't matter what they do, they will not be disturbed as long as they continue to give our actual enemies access to our resources. So what has happened is that young people who have the vibrancy to fight for our continent are now being sidelined because they understand, they've looked at what has happened when young people were put in charge of the continent, how there was a push, let me digress a bit. How old was Kwame Nkrumah when he was the leader of Ghana? How old was Patrice Lumumba? How old was Thomas Sankara? How old was even here in Nigeria? How old was Yakubu Gowon and Murtala Mohammed? And how old was Murtala Mohammed when he was assassinated? These were all young people, who took charge of governance. So what is happening is that there is a prevention of that from happening. I'm talking about the higher dimension of what is happening to our continent. So we should understand this, So unfortunately, we have been caged. That is the truth. We are being caged as young people. We are not being allowed to participate in politics because of the current paradigm of politics across the continent. So of course, young Africans centuries ago and young Africans even in the 50s and 60s and 70s were more pragmatic, took more action for the betterment of the society than we are doing now. And we as young people, we are totally distracted from what's happening. The other day, I was listening to the Kenyan Pan-Africanist, the speaker, Patrice Lumumba, not that of Congo, the speaker, Patrice Lumumba, and he was talking about how young Africans are being fine-tuned from outside. The informations that we continue to download into ourselves are informations that tends to take us away from the real thing. We tend to be so distracted. The reality shows that continue to distract us from the issues at hand. When you look at it, they're all geared towards keeping Africa in such a way that, those who have the vibrancy to salvage this continent are distracted. So it's important, like I've always said, that we as young people should understand what is going on, that we are at war, our continent is not free. Even the war on terror is a proxy war on our continent. And if I may just add, recently, there's a guy called Obietonbara. Obietonbara is the chairman of Executive Outcomes, a South African mercenary group that was subcontracted by the Nigerian government to help fight terrorism. And according to Obietonbara, mind you, the US government is yet to deny this. I've been waiting for a statement from the State Department to see if they will deny this. They are yet to deny this. And even the Nigerian government is yet to deny this. According to Balo, the US intervened and forced the Nigerian government to terminate their contract, in crushing Boko Haram.
All right,
and you ask, why? Why will the US sabotage Nigeria's war on terror?
Right.
Recently, a guy called Hamza al-Mustafa, who was the chief security officer of the former Nigerian head of state, Sani Abacha, has come out to say that in Sambisa forest, where Boko Haram lives, is a resource, a mineral called californium.
All right, apologies, but because of our time, I would like you to hold that thought. We'll be right back to talk about that. So please just hold that thought for a bit and stay with me for a bit. Same to you, Lwazi. I'll be right back with you, gentlemen. But right now, we have to take the Twitter reactions to the U.S. Africa Leadership Summit that is currently ongoing, and they're spotlighting Africa, the youths in Africa. So let's take a look at the Twitter reactions. Africa and our leaders doing their best to implement our deepest challenges with the latest technological advances gives us a lot of hope. The focus areas for the youth in tech are now clearly being redefined. I know a lot of people might disagree with that, but that's Njili Peter's take on the situation. Now, USAID in Africa also had something to say about the US summit, and they say that Africa's youth are the engine of entrepreneurship and innovation, and our African diaspora in the US is a source of strength as well. Same for the USA, that's their opinion on that. Now, David Moinine Sengi says, at the US Africa Leaders Summit 22 Youth and Diaspora Forum, I said that if we are to transform education, we need to change our systems of multilateral and bilateral power relations for effective partnership based on trust and mutual accessibility, where we co-design a shared future. And President Julius Maada Bio says excerpts of a speech at the Africa and Diaspora Youth Leaders Forum on the margins of US Africa Leaders Summit 22. The African youth of today are brave, they're resilient, innovative, entrepreneurial, and more determined to succeed and achieve financial independence than in previous generations. And Chiedza said to the American investors, Africa is open for business, Africa is ready, and they need to create jobs for young people and tap into the demographic youth dividend. Mr. Hardy Pemiwu, the CEO of Cassava Technologies. And finally, empowering youth, cultivate leaders, strengthen institutions, and extend access to education and information is one of the most important priorities, according to Uwezowamugu Emeli, that they should deal with back to Africa after the US Africa Leaders Summit to build more inclusive world. So he's saying that it is not enough to have the summit, it is more to discuss empowering youth in general. Now, I still have my guests with me. I still have Tamunokuro and Lwazi. And Tamunokuro was talking about something earlier, but unfortunately, because of our time, we'll not be able to go deep into that. But Tamunokuro, I'd like to ask you what your final thoughts are on the issue generally.
So my thought, on this issue is this: we need to understand that at the end of the day, no one really cares about us. We have to take actions to protect our interests as a continent, as a people. It's important that we have a leadership that understands the enormous resources that are in Africa, and that there are several countries across the world who wants to have unlimited access to these resources, and we will do anything possible to influence our minds, our perceptions, so that they will have access to these resources, so that they'll be able to control us. And if possible, they will heat up our polities and destabilize our nations if that will give them access to our resources. It's important we understand, the international level to this game that's being played. So we have to come together as a people, as a continent, and work together. If possible, for us to try, I'm glad we're coming up with a single market. We need to also take off the barriers, the so-called borders that prevents easy access to travel. So it's important that we take these steps.
All right, thank you so much. Lwazi, in just a few seconds, what exactly is your final thoughts on this matter?
Thank you so much for the interview. First and foremost, I would like to say that Africa is not a homogeneous continent, and therefore in our diversity, we as Africans have managed to make it through the hardest parts of our settler colonial history. And part and parcel of that is realizing that we need better leaders, and leaders will be able to usher us into a new age where Africa works in more cohesive and united form, including negotiating better on international platforms and to not be treated as the doldrum of the international community. And reasserting our voices within the international community, we will become critical going forward as we as Africans try to trajectory our vision towards 2063 with the Africa we want. So, and I also encourage the youth to take advantage of the political process and enter the politics and contest those who are older and ensure that we build a more sustainable continent in future.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Tamunokuro, writer and Pan-Africanist, and also a big thank you to Lwazi, the senior researcher all the way from South Africa. Really do appreciate your time with us on the show. Now, we have had iconic leaders before us, and it's expedient that we refer to their messages, especially to us youths from time to time. And that's why in this next episode, we'll be taking a look at some strong messages left for us as quotes. Well, it's been a very beautiful 1 hour show with you, my viewer, on this episode of Fafanua Afrika. Join me same time, same station next week for another 1 hour of youth discourse. Till then, I'm Blessings Mosugu.